Yeah, I watched the other video and typed a commentary on my coughing, so
not at the center.
try not to breathe.
But in an eccentric center, in a corner whose eccentricity assures the solid concentration of the system, participating in the construction of what it, at the same time, threatens to deconstruct. One might then be inclined to reach this conclusion. Deconstruction is not an operation that supervenes afterwards, from the outside, one fine day. It is always already at work in the work. Since the disruptive force of deconstruction is always already contained within the very architecture of the work, all one would finally have to do to be able to deconstruct, given this always already, is to do memory work. Yet since I want neither to accept or to reject a conclusion formulated in precisely these terms, let us leave this question suspended for the moment.
So this is where existentialism went. Remember existentialism? We think about Kierkegaard, we think about Sartre, we think about Nietzsche, lots of literature throughout continental Europe. So existentialism was essentially the continental European philosophical viewpoint from at least World War II through, right? In certain places, I would argue that it's become American pragmatism now, especially in Germany, not so much France, but there's been certainly a merger of the analytic British tradition and the continental philosophical viewpoint. But deconstruction is the heir to that existential viewpoint. And the focus is on freedom, and freedom from those people like Hitler, or very specifically George Bush. For a lot of them, they were horrified with what George Bush was doing in our country after 9/11, where he basically was able to gather the will of the people and commit to attacking Afghanistan and Iraq. Remember, the French were against that, right? And part of the reason they were against it was because they felt that you really can't fight terror as a verb. You can't fight terror by attacking specific places and everything. And they were actually legitimately concerned that wars in those places would literally just make things worse. And by the way, in retrospect, when we look now at of course, what's happened there with ISIS, awful lot of analysis argues that the reason ISIS is there and that it's worse than Saddam Hussein or Assad in Syria, etc., was because literally those tyrants that we didn't think very highly of because they were not espousing what we think of as good democratic, free, liberal principles, were necessary in that environment. And an awful lot of people still don't feel like it's right to say that, that a society could be basically so structured, primitive, that they cannot be fixed to be like Anchorage, with people being raised with the liberties that we have and so on. You can't do it. They just don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the belief system, they might not even have the language that enables people to have that kind of self-reflective individuality that goes with the rights that we think of as belonging to us. And so by basically decapitating those systems and cutting off the authority, we allowed chaos to blossom there. So that's kind of a French point of view with that. And what Derrida's focus on deconstruction is deconstructing the meta-narratives of those authorities that would control the sheeple. the people that are sheep, basically, right? So what you're literally watching while Bush stood there in New York with the firemen around him at the ground zero on the ruins, and said, they will hear us, soon, right? We're going to go blow them up for doing this, etc. Right? Bush and the neocons were basically constructing a meta-narrative, a story that explained what our role was, how we were to fight against this enemy, etc. Right? So they're constructing that narrative. Whether we believe the narrative and feel like it was a good one, etc., or not, the thing is, the French interpretation is this is meta-narrative construction, right? And it's going to have a worldwide cataclysmic effect. And the obligation of the virtuous philosopher, in the French parlance, right, is to deconstruct that meta-narrative. In other words, to blow it apart, to keep you from finding it believable, right? So go in and criticize what Bush says. Criticize what anyone saying, describing things that way. Anything that looks like it's going to gather everybody, unify us behind a threat of force, applying a threat of force, right? Stop the threat, stop that kind of behavior. And the way you do it is by making the things that they say unbelievable, right? Deconstruct them, take them apart, make fun of it, joke about it, like the Monty Python does, actually, right? That kind of thing. Make it humorous, make George Bush look silly, right? Instead of presidential, right? Do things like, that video, who's on first, right? Right? And you don't even have to follow rules. So it's not like there's rules to the game. The whole thing is you don't have to say things that make you coherent. Your logic doesn't have to be coherent. In a sense, coherence is part of a meta-narrative and not necessarily worthwhile if the meta-narrative doesn't actually achieve the goals you set out to. For increased freedom, what they want to accomplish is deconstructing the meta-narratives of the authorities that try to control other people. Because by doing that, that basically frees everyone from those authorities, right? They're unbelievable, I don't listen to authority, I'm my own person, etc. So you can see how that really follows through with the existentialist program. It also confuses a lot of the analytic tradition, because the analytic tradition was aimed at making language a much more precise tool. And so the attempt to analyze language, as Quine was doing, and others of his school, are essentially trying to refine language so that we're getting more and more logical and more precise, more scientific, right? And the deconstructionists feel like that language is a dynamic, interrelated set of language games that from one context to another can be totally reinterpreted. And even in the one context, there's a multiplicity of interpretations. So you can believe one thing. I can know exactly what you know and believe something totally different. I think I mentioned like the conflict between Howard Zinn and, did I talk about Howard Zinn and Stephen Ambrose? Two different historians, for example. So Howard Zinn so that's one side. Think about, okay, let me put up the other one, Stephen Ambrose. Did meet Stephen Ambrose. He was here, I guess in the 90s. He gave a lecture in the old theater on 4th Avenue. Remember that old theater that's down there? Where the homeless pee in the side there. Really foul-smelling alley there. I don't know if you've ever walked in that area. But he was introduced by Mrs. Tony Knowles, Susan Knowles? I forget her first name. When Tony was governor. So his wife was the governor's wife, and she introduced him. And his voice was really harsh because he was dying from cancer of the throat. But notice that you've probably seen some of his movies, Saving Private Ryan. What's the other one? Platoon, is it? Yeah, Platoon, I think. But he was a historian that wrote Band of Brothers, that's the one. Saving Private Ryan, The World at War, Lewis and Clark, The Journey of with Ken Burns. So pretty darn prolific and important and very, I think it had a great deal of impact, his interpretation of our history on our media through, and us, of course, through that. And his interpretation was always very positive. America, granted, individuals did things that we regret, but nonetheless, the general drift of everything was this manifest destiny, progress. America's the best thing that's ever been in the world, etc. I'm totally persuaded by all of that. I'm sure. And then when you look at Howard Zinn is looking at things from the bottom up. So the other night, for example, there was a video going around from Norway of whales, orcas, swimming in a pod outside of a fjord with the northern lights above. I don't know. Did you see it? I don't know if I can show it to you or not. I suppose it depends on cooperation with this device here. Let me in. Good. We get some really weird things. Here it is. I can't make it bigger. So whales, Northern Lights. It's Norway though, so it's not here. So my post was, now Howard Zinn, so everyone's saying how beautiful this is. So my comment is, now Howard Zinn would describe the scene from the flight of the herring they are probably gobbling up. Right? And it's not nearly as beautiful if you're herring, trying to make it to the spawning grounds. Mm-hmm. And instead, you're being swallowed up by all these whales, right? Actually, do orcas eat herring? I don't think so. It's the
seals.
Beluga, I guess, do. You've seen pictures of them using the bubbles to basically net them, mm-hmm. And once they're all surrounded, then they come up and they just scoop them all up. I don't think that's orcas. But so Howard Zinn, his books are from the people's point of view, and by people he means the people that were oppressed. So the Indians that were being destroyed, all the folks that lost in these encounters, right? And of course, from that point of view, all of the exact same events are absolutely atrocious, horrible. Same exact event, totally different interpretation, right? So that's why I put Stephen Ambrose and Howard Zinn. There's two perfectly, in a sense, heroic I would say, academics take a particular perspective, look at exactly the same data, and give you totally different interpretations of it. And so, in a sense, being human, we can have our own interpretation of data. Remember, that's something that's really come out at least since David Hume, that we can have multiple interpretations of exactly the same thing. And it's not that one interpretation is true and the others are almost true. No, they're all interpretations. So stories are neither true nor false. They're interpretive ways of viewing the data, right? And that being the case, then you feel perfectly legitimate to have a deconstructive approach where you don't care what interpretation you use. You don't even have to be consistent with yourself, because the main thing that you're trying to do is deconstruct the authority figure who's trying to persuade people to believe their interpretation, their story, and then use that power over those people to accomplish whatever it is they're setting out to do. Now, obviously, it depends on what they're trying to do. If you're trying to go to war, that's something that Derrida would certainly be against. If it's instead increasing the number of dollars you get paid per hour of work, they would probably be for that, because they definitely have kind of a socialist bent. You know, if you think about I think of Thomas Piketty. And his book a couple summers ago, 2 summers ago, it's the blockbuster economics book. How many of you have ever read a blockbuster economics book, let alone that year's blockbuster? And so,
okay, so it's very nice to be here tonight. So I've been working on the history of income and wealth distribution for the past 15 years.
You follow what he's saying?
One of the interesting lesson coming from this historical evidence is indeed that in the long run, there is a tendency for the rate of return of capital to exceed the economy's growth rate. And this tends to lead to high concentration of wealth, not infinite concentration of wealth, but the higher the gap between R and G, and the higher the level of inequality of wealth towards society tends to converge. So this is the key force that I'm going to talk about today. But let me say right away that this is not the only important force in the dynamics of income and wealth distribution. And there are many other forces that play an important role in the long-run dynamics of income and wealth distribution. Also, there is a lot of data that still needs to be collected. So, we know a little bit more today than we used to know, but we still know too little. And, certainly there are many different processes, economic, social, political, that need to be studied more. And so I'm going to focus today on this simple force, but that doesn't mean that other important forces do not exist. So most of the data I'm going to present comes from this database that's available online, the World Top Income Database. So this is the largest existing historical database on inequality, and this comes from the effort of over 30 scholars from several dozen countries. So let me show you a couple of facts coming from this database, and then we'll return to R bigger than G. So fact number 1 is that there's been a big reversal in the ordering of income inequality between the United States and Europe over the past century. So back in 1900, 1910, income inequality was actually much higher in Europe than in the United States, whereas today it is a lot higher in the United States. So let me be very clear, the main explanation for this is not R bigger than G. It has more to do with changing supply and demand for skill, the race between education and technology, globalization, probably more unequal access to skills in the US, where you have very good, very top universities, but where the bottom part of the educational system is not as good, so very unequal access to skills, and also an unprecedented rise of top managerial compensation of the United States, which is difficult to account alone just on the basis of education. So there is more going on here, but I'm not going to talk too much about this today because I want to focus on wealth inequality. So let me just show you a very simple indicator about the income inequality part. So this is the share of total income going to the top 10%. So you can see that 1 century ago it was between 45 and 50% in Europe and a little bit above 40% in the US, so there was more inequality in Europe. Then there was a sharp decline during the first half of the 20th century, and in the recent decade, you can see that the US has become more unequal than Europe, and you know, this is the first fact I just talked about. Now, the second fact is more about wealth inequality, and here the central fact is that wealth inequality is always a lot higher than income inequality, and also that you know, wealth inequality, although it has also increased in recent decades, is still less extreme today than what it was a century ago, although the total quantity of wealth relative to income has now recovered from the very large shocks caused by World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. So let me show you two graphs illustrating fact number 2 and fact number 3. So first, you know, if you look at the level of wealth inequality, so this is you know, the share of total wealth going to top 10% wealth holders. So you can see the same kind of reversal between the US and Europe that we had before for income inequality. So wealth concentration was higher in Europe than in the US a century ago, and now it is the opposite. But you can also show two things. First, the general level of wealth inequality are always higher than income inequality. So remember, for income inequality, you know, the share going to the top 10% was between, you know, 30 and 50% of total income. Whereas for wealth, you know, the share are always between 60 and 90%. Okay, so that's fact number 1, and that's very important for what follows. You know, wealth concentration is always a lot higher than income concentration. Fact number 2 is that, you know, the rise in wealth inequality in recent decades is still not enough to get us back, you know, to 1910. So the big difference, you know, today wealth inequality is still very large, with 60–70% of total wealth for the top 10. But you know, the good news is that it's actually better than 1 century ago, where you had, you know, 90% in Europe going to the top 10. So today, what you have is what I call the middle 40%, you know, the people who are not in the top 10 and who are not in the bottom 50, and what you can view as the wealth middle class that owns 20–30% of total wealth, national wealth, whereas they used to be as poor a century ago when there was basically no wealth middle class. So this is, you know, an important change, and it's interesting to see that wealth inequality has not fully recovered to pre-World War I level, although the total quantity of wealth, you know, has recovered. Okay, so this is the total value of wealth relative to income, and you can see that in particular in Europe we are almost back to the pre-World War I level. So there's really two different parts of the story here. You know, one has to do with the total quantity of wealth that we accumulate, and there is nothing bad per se, of course, in accumulating a lot of wealth, and in particular if it is more diffused and less concentrated. So what we really want to focus on is the long-run evolution of wealth inequality and what's going to happen in the future. How can we account for the fact that until World War I, wealth inequality was so high, and if anything was rising to even higher levels, and you know, how can we think about the future? So let me come to, you know, some of the, you know, the explanation and speculation about the future. Let me first say that, you know, probably the best model to explain why wealth is so much more concentrated than income is a dynastic models where individuals have long horizon and accumulate wealth for all sorts of reasons. If people were accumulating wealth only for life cycle reasons, you know, to be able to consume when they are old, then the level of wealth inequality should be more or less in line with the level of income inequality. But it will be very difficult to explain why you have so much more wealth inequality than income inequality with a pure life cycle model. So you need a story where people also care about wealth accumulation for other reasons. So typically they want to transmit wealth to the next generation, to their children, or sometimes they want to accumulate wealth because of the prestige, the power that goes with wealth. Because there must be other reasons for accumulating wealth than just life cycle to explain what we see in the data. Now, in a large class of dynamic models of wealth accumulation with such a dynastic motive for accumulating wealth, so you will have all sorts of random multiplicative shocks. So for instance, some families have a very large number of children, so the wealth will be divided. Some families have fewer children. You also have shocks to rates of return. Some families make huge capital gains, some make bad investments. So you will always have some mobility in the wealth process. Some people will move up, some people will move down. The important point is that in any such model, for a given variance of such shocks, the equilibrium level of wealth inequality will be a steeply rising function of R minus G. And intuitively, the reason why the difference between the rate of return to wealth and the growth rate is important is that initial wealth inequalities will be amplified at a faster pace with a bigger R minus G. So take a simple example, with R equal 5% and G equal 1%, wealth holders only need to reinvest 1/5 of their capital income to ensure that their wealth rises as fast as the size of the economy. Okay? So this makes it easier to build and perpetuate large fortunes because you can consume 4/5, assuming zero tax, and you can just reinvest 1/5. So of course some family will consume more than that, some will consume less, so there will be some mobility in the distribution, but on average they only need to reinvest 1/5, and so this allows high wealth inequalities to sustain. Now, you should not be surprised by the statement that R can be bigger than G forever, because in fact, this is what happened during most of the history of mankind, and this was, in a way, very obvious to everybody, for a simple reason, which is that growth was close to 0%. During most of the history of mankind, growth was maybe 0.1, 0.2, 0.3%, but very slow growth of population and output per capita. Whereas the rate of return to capital, of course, was not 0%. It was for land assets, which was the traditional form of assets in pre-industrial societies, it was typically 5%. So, any reader of Jane Austen will know that, if you want an annual income of £1,000, you should have a capital value of £20,000, so that 5% of 20,000 is 1,000. And in a way, this was the very foundation of society, because this is what R bigger than G was what allowed holders of wealth and assets to live off their capital income and to do something else in life than just to care about their own survival. Now, one important conclusion of my historical research is that modern industrial growth did not change this basic fact as much as one might have expected. Of course, the growth rate following the Industrial Revolution rose, typically from 0 to 1 to 2%, but at the same time, the rate of return to capital also rose, so that the gap between the two did not really change. So, so during the 20th century, you had a very unique combination of events. First, a very low rate of return due to the 1914-1945 war shocks, destruction of wealth, inflation, bankruptcy during the Great Depression, and all of this reduced the private rate of return to wealth to unusually low levels between 1914 and 1945. And then in the post-war period, you had unusually high growth rate, partly due to the Reconstruction. In Germany, in France, in Japan, you have 5% growth rate between 1950 and 1980, largely due to Reconstruction, and also due to very large demographic growth, the baby boom cohort effect. Now, apparently, that's not going to last for very long, or at least the population growth is supposed to decline in the future, and the best projections we have is that the long run growth is going to be closer to 1 to 2% rather than 4 to 5%. So if you look at this, these are the best estimates we have of world GDP growth and rate of return to capital, average rates of return to capital. So you can see that during most of the history of mankind, the growth rate was very small, much lower than the rate of return. And then during the 20th century, it is really the population growth very high in the post-war period and the reconstruction process that brought growth to a smaller gap with the rate of return. Here I use the United Nations population projections. So, of course, they are uncertain. It could be that we all start having a lot of children in the future and that the growth rate are going to be higher. But from now on, these are the best projections we have, and this will make global growth decline and the gap between, with the rate of return go up. Now, the other unusual event during the 20th century was, as I said, destruction, taxation of capital. So this is the pre-tax rate of return. This is the after-tax rate of return and after destruction. And this is what brought the average rate of return after tax, after destruction, below the growth rate during a long time period. But without the destruction, without the taxation, this would not have happened. Okay? So let me say that the balance between returns of capital and growth, depends on many different factors that are very difficult to predict. Technology and the development of capital-intensive techniques. So, right now the most capital-intensive sector in the economy are the real estate sector, housing, the energy sector. But it could be in the future that we'll have a lot more robots in a number of sectors, and that this will be a bigger share of the total capital stock that it is today. Well, we are very far from this, and from now on, what's going on in the real estate sector, the energy sector is much more important for the total capital stock and capital share. The other important issue is that there are scale effects in portfolio management, together with financial complexity, financial deregulation, that make it easier to get higher rates of return for large portfolio. And this seems to be particularly strong for billionaires, large capital endowments. Just to give you one example, this comes from the Forbes billionaire rankings over the 1987-2013 period, and you can see that very top wealth holders have been going up at 6-7% per year in real terms, above inflation, whereas average income in the world, average wealth in the world have increased only at 2% per year. Okay? And you find the same for large university endowments. The bigger the initial endowments, the bigger the rate of return. Now, what could be done? The first thing is that, I think we need more financial transparency. We know too little about global wealth dynamics, so we need international transmission of bank information. We need a global registry of financial assets, more coordination on wealth taxation. And even wealth tax with a small tax rate would be a way to produce information so that then we can adapt our policies to whatever we observe. And to some extent, the fight against tax havens and automatic transmission of information is pushing us in this direction. Now, there are other ways to redistribute wealth, which it can be tempting to use. Inflation, it's much easier to print money than to write a tax code, so that's very tempting, but sometimes you don't know what you do with the money. This is a problem. Expropriation, is very tempting, just when you feel some people get too wealthy, you just expropriate them, but this is not a very efficient way to organize the regulation of wealth dynamics. So wars is an even less efficient way, so I tend to prefer progressive taxation, but of course, history will invent its own pathways, and it will probably involve a combination of all of this. Thank you.
Piketty. Thank you. Thank you. I want to ask you 2 or 3 questions, because it's impressive how you are in command of your data.
So, unless you wanted to listen to those. So the book was very impressive, although also depressing, because basically it says that the situation that we find ourselves in, where more and more of the wealth is going to the top 1%, he kept talking about 10%, that's still, of course, applicable, but we especially like to emphasize the 1%. You've heard them talking about we are the 99%, et cetera, which is obviously a big, if you're the top 10%, you're much better off than someone in the, the bottom, of course. But what his book emphasized was that the only reason we had essentially a middle class occurred because of the destruction of World War I and World War II, and that enabled a certain number of people to end up with more percentage of the wealth than normally would be the arrangement, right? But then since that recovery has occurred, basically we've gone back to the norm, where you have just those who are wealthy using their wealth to make more wealth, and those that are everyone else, basically, we're making money. We're earning money by work, right? Not by having our money make money, but instead we go out, work for Sears, teach at university, whatever your job is, you get paid for that. So guess what? The distinction between the super wealthy and everyone else is just going to keep growing for very natural historical economic reasons. Unless you want to have another World War III or something, no one wants that, because that was actually incredibly destructive for everyone, not just changing the way this works out. So basically, get used to it. There will be very few wealthy people. If you're not one of those, don't count on changing that circumstance anytime soon, becoming a billionaire. Of course, it does happen. There are individuals that break through this, although they're actually very small. The movie stars, the J.K. Rowling's, they're actually very small percentage-wise. It's really wealth itself is so. And the other issue to this, of course, is that the growth, which changed that a little bit, right, slowed that difference down a little bit, occurred primarily because of the Reconstruction after the destruction of World War I and World War II. And by the way, it's clearly still going on as we have, 8 billion people on the world today. When I was born, there was 1.5 billion, thereabouts, so we've quadrupled the size of the population. That's growth, right? So that would be one reason why there was so much growth. But because of lots of factors, that growth has really bottomed out and decreased. And so an awful lot, for example, of our programs, like here in town, we have retirement benefits, for example. If you were a policeman, you have a really good retirement package. But the plan for paying that retirement package was based on future growth of the municipality, which then would be able to afford to pay all these retirement packages. Well, guess what? We're actually shrinking instead of growing, so we actually turn out not to have the money coming in from future tax that will pay for the benefits we've already promised all these people, right? Because one of the reasons why Alaska at the moment says, gosh, even if we fire everybody that works for the state, we would still need more money to pay all the promised benefits to the people that have already retired than we're getting in the income that's coming into the state right now. So even if we fired everybody, basically trashed the whole state, we still wouldn't be able to afford to pay what we're obligated to pay because of the plan to essentially assume that growth would keep on going so that the eventual income would be so much higher it would cover all the things. We didn't put money away to cover all that. By the way, if you use the stock market as your way of raising capital, guess what? The decrease in growth was literally one of the reasons why the stock market has decreased. In fact, occasionally you get your return and discover you actually lost money on your investment. So that's fun. When you're figuring, oh, I'm going to retire off of this. Whoa, it's going away faster than it's you put in $10,000 this quarter and you lose 40. Whoa, that's not something you can plan on living off of, right? Because it's not growing enough for you to spend any of it. You're basically losing money by having it sitting there. So how do you, of course, how do the really wealthy, of course, raise money? By owning corporations, by building Trump Towers. Well, you get the idea, right? You have to use your money in ways that takes a lot of money to do, right? Buying gold, probably not a good idea. I don't know why so many people fall for that, especially when most of those companies that sell gold don't actually sell you the gold, they sell you a gold certificate. They keep the gold, they give you the certificate. So when you need the gold, you turn around and say, oh, I want my gold back. And they're like, who? Who do you mean? We don't. Insurance companies, another problem, right? Most insurance policies never pay. If you think about it, how do the insurance companies work out as such a good investment vehicle? It's because they sell all these policies, everyone pays the premiums, but guess what? By the time you're about ready to die, you decide you can't afford the premiums because they're so expensive, so you cancel the policy, so the insurance company never has to pay you. So you've been paying them money all these years, but they haven't ever had to give you anything. It's different with like things like automobile policy, because if you crash, then they have to pay. But then what do? As soon as you've had an accident,
Your rates go up.
your rates go up, right? And so on, right? You know how that works, right? And Lord help us if we all have an earthquake at the same time, which as far as I know is the only way you could do it. Because then the insurance companies turn around and say, oh, well, you know, we insured this house, we insured all these houses, but you know what? We can't afford to fix them all. Forget it, you know. We're bankrupt. You know. Well, where do I get the money to fix my house? Go ask your aunt, you know.
Don't they liquidate the insurance company at that point if it was to go bankrupt?
Well, what's
Take
funny
all
is
the
some
assets.
of the insurance companies insure themselves. They do. They go to Lloyd's of London, and Lloyd's of London insures them so they actually pay premiums on their insurance policies to cover themselves in case they have major catastrophes that they can't afford to pay. But guess what? Lloyd's can't pay it either. It's a Ponzi scheme. Have you ever heard of that? Yes?
Mm-hmm.
So, he's delivering facts. Can we deconstruct those facts? There's clearly interpretations. He's clearly applying interpretations to that. Can we actually, though, use something like that and criticize the deconstructionists and say that, you know, it's not all just interpretation. Facts are facts. And when you get right down to it, the numbers are very clear. I mean, you know, obviously he says we're not gathering that much data. Most of the data he had came from France. If you read the book goes back to quite long ago because France literally was keeping track of money pretty far back. So that's where an awful lot of the good data comes from.
How did they keep track of everything through all the revolutions they had? They had something like 15 revolutions.
And you could read the book, actually. You know, he footnotes an awful lot of really great resources. So that was why, you know, this was, you know, such a detailed study, but at the same time depressing, which means, oh, well, you know, the norm is for us to have very, very wealthy at the top and everybody else at the bottom. And we're just really fortunate that we've got as large a middle class remnant as we have. But for the most part, even that's going to be passé eventually. You'll just basically go back to this Platonic triangle, yeah, without, you know, it being the elite educated at the top, but it'll instead be the wealthy at the top. So it's not really the Platonic ideal, but you'll have all the peasants at the bottom, basically servants one way or the other. And then you'll have the middle class, which would be the educated, so there would be that reversal. Obviously living a better life, but then you'll have that small percentage at the top, very small. So it's not even like, you know, that big chunk, but it would be a very, very small chunk at the top that would have their own planes, basically decide, I'm going to run for president and have enough money to win. You know, that kind of thing. So I highly recommend it, but at the same time wonder, well, how do we deconstruct it? I don't think we can, because data is data. Isn't that a really good I mean, remember his recommendations at the end. Well, you can steal the money from the wealthy once you get upset with them. That sounds like a communist revolution. But guess what? That doesn't really work very well. We've seen that. And actually, those kinds of things end up just making life miserable for everybody. Worse than what it was before, right? Especially since the new folks that come into power basically don't understand how power works. They understand how to run a revolution, obviously, if they're successful. But once they get into office, what typically happens then, of course, is other people like Stalin kill them. You know, because because they're not doing a very good job as a bureaucracy, right? So you have the bureaucrat folks take over, and you're back into the same sort of structure, right? So I suppose the bad news here is that humans are humans, and we structure ourselves a certain way, and we just have to get used to it, I suppose. So I'm not sure if we can deconstruct that to the point where we can make, I suppose the main solution that he has is redistribution of more of the wealth through a graduated income tax or a tax on wealth. That's what I've seen little bits of in the press lately, with everyone upset with all of the wealth that was being hidden in these shell companies in Panama and obviously other places, that we really ought to kind of go to a global taxing structure so that people that have wealth can have it taxed no matter where they have it, so that there's more of an equity among others. Does that make sense? Another part of the European way of doing philosophy and arguing with one another feels like doublespeak in a way.
The formal aspect of these attacks, there is a great difference between attack, catastrophes, killings in our Western metropolises and in third world or other countries. With ours is we have our ordinary lives, like in Paris the last week, cafeterias are full, rock concerts, and then boom, something happens, but happens and it's over. And then we have all this humanitarian bullshit, we sympathize and so on and so on. But you know, here I refer to a conservative philosopher, but he's not always a total idiot, Peter Sloterdijk, who said, are we aware that we in the West, we live as if in an isolated cupola. We see the outside, but we don't see the wall. We know about horrors going on out there in the third world and so on, but it's for us really another reality. We see through TV screens and so on. Only from time to time we get a little bit of, like, moment. Don't look at me like this.
Yeah, you know, when I look at you, you have
very
to
short, yes. Momentary interruption. So for me, the most what this Paris, we should have unconditional solidarity with Paris people, but not just because they suffered, but because they got a taste, a momentary taste, one evening, what in many countries outside our cupola, from Lebanon to Syria to Congo, not to mention all those countries, is their daily life. The most beautiful statement that I got from a refugee, because, and that's the true tragedy, the greatest victim of Paris attacks will be refugees. And it's an obscenity, because they who basically escaped from the same terror that strike Paris, they are now by European anti-immigrant right-wingers portrayed as the other face of terror. So one of them said on Slovene TV something so beautiful. He said, all our sympathy to the people of Paris, because what you experienced for one night, that was our permanent life there. And that's what we are escaping from. We have, I think that Paris murders should be also an instigation for us to become fully aware of incredible amount of all types of violence, religious, military, sexual violence, like in South Africa, my black friends are telling me. You know that there, every 4 minutes a woman is raped, every 8 hours a woman is killed by her sexual partner, and so on and so on. You know, we should learn to watch through the cracks of our cupola. That's the temptation that you mentioned. Not to close our cupola, not the automatic anti-immigrant reaction of closing off the cupola.
So that's, oops, Slavoj Zizek. Some call him the most dangerous philosopher alive today. I'm sure that's a joke because he's more funny than, well, I mean, he's obviously serious, but at the same time, he's loaded with humor constantly. And by the way, it's all filthy. Sorry about that, but it is, you know, and I don't know if it's because he's Slovenian, although he says it is, so, you know.
Their culture, huh?
Well, Slovenia was one of the parts of Yugoslavia that when Tito died and they rebelled and basically created then a mess, right? And so they each ended up with their separate independence, although some had to battle for it, like Kosovo. By the way, he, even though he has lots of books, and I'm sure he's got so let's, I guess we've got to go to the whole, you get the idea. He's been very, very prolific. This is all his writings, etc., right? Notice he's polyglot, so he speaks all these, or he, I don't know if he, I know he writes his own stuff in English, and yet Slovenian is his actual language. So there, watch the one on Slovenian TV. I don't know where it is. This looks like it.
Kako hoćete. Poštovani gledatelji, dobar dan u još jednoj emisiji Nedjeljom u 2. Gost nam je jedan od najpoznatijih Slovenaca, Slavoj Žižek, čovjek koji voli. Zanimljiv mu je, ajmo reći. Pol Pot ima na zidu u svojoj sobi ima slike Staljina i Lenjina. Ne voli baš previše Tita.
Više problematično.
Tito je više problematičan, dobar dan i dobrodošli.
Hvala. Samo da vas popravim. Definitivno ne najpoznatiji Slovenac u svijetu. To je danas Melania Knaus, žena Donalda Trumpa.
Vidite, nekad treba biti Melania Knaus, imati 30 i nešto godina, ali što je najvažnije biti sa Trumpom.
Slava means glory.
Trump je, ja mislim, egocentrična, potpuna budala. Čak nije dobar biznismen.
Turn on the subtitles and hope that the YouTube...
Šta žene vide u tim tipovima?
YouTube will do automatic subtitles.
Problem ženska želja, to je Freud znao.
It's not really good. That's right. I was going to say, you can hope for an accurate interpretation.
So watch though as he speaks, he has the exact same mannerisms and the same tick that he does when he speaks.
Za ljude koji ne znaju, vi se bavite filozofijom. Međutim, da ne budemo ekstra dosadni, ajmo za početak da kažete našem općinstvu, zašto je Pol Pot kandidat?
A lot of the words are the same.
Zašto ste sablažnjavali javnost kad ste se nekada 90-ih kandidirali za predsjedništvo Slovenije ističući njegove komparativne prednosti?
Pa, nikakve, ja zapravo sada mi niko to neće vjerovati, jer ja nisam htio biti izabran. Ja sam samo htio pomoći svojoj stranci tada na izborima, ali šta me zanima kod Pol Pota? To je bio jedan ekstreman režim u kome su neke, da tako kažem, povijesne tendencije se izrazile u... Liberal way, liberals don't like people who are ready to sacrifice themselves. For them, if you are too radical, you are already one step towards totalitarianism.
virtue without terror is impotent, terror without virtue is blind, no? I accept this totally, I don't have any problem, I mean, the crucial point of every radical movement is to have terror through virtue. In order to establish the fundamentals of democracy, you have to go through this zero level of Jacobinism. You cannot say we could have done it in a much easier way. My God, if you read some of the attacks on Robespierre, it would have seemed as if, you know, they exerted a full dictatorship, just played this game, how can we kill more people? Are people aware that practically, literally, the whole of Europe declared war on France? Foreign powers effectively were...
So this is in his apartment. This is a great interview.
Now you stopped. Now we can say long live Stalin or what. We are not recorded there.
Slavoj Zizek is a big, friendly Slovenian Marxist intellectual who spends as much time blathering on about Batman films as he does about Hegel. He's written about 75 books, most of which remain impenetrable to me, but it's his public appearances, both at lectures and at events like Occupy Wall Street, which have really cemented his position as the most broadly popular anti-capitalist philosopher working today. This is because, unlike pretty much every other anti-capitalist philosopher, he actually has a sense of humour. His latest project is a film, The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, directed by Sophie Fiennes. In it, Slav uses Hollywood blockbusters to explain why the bulk of us remain so enthralled to capitalist power structures that we cannot even escape them in our sleep. I wanted to know why I was such a sheeple, so I went to Slovenia to meet the man.
Hello.
See, sheeple, it's a real word.
You hate life.
So this is his hometown.
Whatever. So we go my place there. No?
Amazing, fantastic. When you're in town here, do you ever get approached by local fans or something like that?
What do you mean by fans? People hate me pretty much here. I wasn't for independent Slovenia. I didn't care about that. I also didn't have any Yugoslav nostalgia. Many leftists have it, and they consider me a traitor there. My nostalgia is for the old times 40 years ago, when I was young. You know, even phones were not used so much. This was nice because once a day, in the morning, those arrived, and that was it.
That was all communication.
Yeah, then you know you are free for 24 hours.
I noticed you've got Joe Stalin.
This is just so that it, not, I don't mean you personally, idiots when they enter the flat ask me why do you have that. It's strictly for this.
It's just to annoy people.
Absolutely just to annoy people.
I've read on the front of your books it's quoted that you're the most dangerous philosopher
Stalin is one
in
of his
the
heroes.
West. You don't seem very dangerous to me.
Here I must disappoint you. You know, I am this
Look
type
at the
of a
crappy little
Joker guy.
apartment
I'm
he
the
has.
Joker from Batman. You know.
Yeah, I know.
I laugh and
All
so
the books
on, but I can be a Stalinist. If you give me power, I know how to use it. That's why I'm afraid almost of myself. I don't want power. I'm extremely sensitive. It's beautiful that you were on time there.
Yeah.
You know, even in love relations, you know what's my motto? I quote Lacan. When he says, my fiancée is never late for an appointment because the moment she is late, she's no longer my fiancée. You know what's one of my tricks? I like it. When I give a talk, or especially if it's a debate, it's good to begin on time or even a little bit earlier. Because then people who are even on time or 2 minutes late feel a little bit guilty, you know.
Why do you want them to feel guilty? Just so
Because they don't ask stupid, annoying questions. I hate debates. People think that I like to give talks. No, I like to write.
If you don't like giving talks, how do you feel about making films? Because obviously The Pervert's Guide to Ideology is coming out. That's
now you
what we're talking
touched
about.
a very dramatic point. I'm disgusted. Just
Some of his English use
on
is
screen.
odd.
So it's not some kind of a extravaganza.
I don't know
to
that
say,
we've
well,
ever said
really,
a
I
dramatic
didn't see-
point.
I saw neither Pervert's Guides to Cinema nor this one Pervert's Guide to Ideology. I am too horrified at looking at myself on screen. Ordinary Americans, as ordinary people in all countries, have a multitude of fears. We fear all kinds of things. We fear maybe immigrants or people whom we perceive as lower than ourselves,
From
attacking
Jaws.
us, robbing us. In Steven Spielberg's Jaws, the function of the shark is to unite all these fears so that we can, in a way, trade all these fears for one fear alone.
Why is cinema such a useful tool for you?
Are we done?
When you're trying to analyze the world?
We are.
Mostly, the way I talk about cinema is simply
you could watch
to
him.
use it to illustrate where we are today.
Tons of
How do
stuff.
we experience
All
our
of
lives?
that.
What do we...
I did post a quiz question, if you get the chance. Oh, and remember, we do have the final, we don't have a class on Tuesday, we just have the session on Thursday. I meant to bring, I think the time is correct on the syllabus, right? Actually, I know I posted it here, but I posted it on the blog. So our our final session is from 10 to 12:45 here in this room. And we'll be watching a movie. I didn't talk to you about what movie. Did we vote on what movie people want to watch?
You mentioned The Life of David Gale, and that was actually...
And I have ordered it. It should be here by
now. Oh, you
now.
don't have it yet. I was wondering if you'd ever actually watched it.
No, I haven't.
Kevin Spacey. It's a good movie. From what I recall.
I also ordered Irrational Man, although I'm not that happy with the plot because the philosophy professor's the bad guy. Plus, it's a Woody Allen film, and a lot of people hate him. Yeah. Well, it's you should not marry your daughter. That's just
Wrong on so many levels.
the wrong approach. I think to. Granted, she was an adopted daughter, but still, that's wrong. And I'm not allowed to talk otherwise about it because I have 2 adopted daughters, and I don't want anyone to think they would shoot me, even if they thought, no, never mind. So, did I have so quiz question is, how can I improve the class? What do you think? But that's a quiz question, so you can.
Should dress up as philosophers.
If you haven't noticed, all semester I've been wearing specific things to basically symbolize specific relationships. When I don't wear togas. I actually kind of use C.S. Lewis more as the kind of the model. C.S. Lewis, Isaiah Berlin, the British kind of, that Oxbridge environment, kind of sets the appropriate image. I could dress like Slavoj Zizek. A dirty T-shirt, You too.
I think we should watch Harry Potter.
Oh, wow. We could watch Harry Potter. Actually, I'm still missing Harry Potter 2. I lent it to a friend, and she hasn't watched it, and she hasn't returned it. I've got to get on her, but in a metaphorical way,
See ya. Bye.
See ya. Bye. Thanks.